Hello, my name's Gail Thomas Strong, and I'm pleased to welcome you to Planning Effective Programs. I hope during our time today, you will have the opportunity to learn two really important things. One is that you'll learn to define the flow and sequence of the program logic model. And secondly, you'll be able to tie that to program planning, particularly when you begin to think about how to raise funds for your program. So let's dive in. Here's some things to think about. Many of us who work in nonprofit organizations do programs all the time. But let's just think about what are the attributes and characteristics of those programs. First off, those are always aligned with mission and the plans of your organization. And programs, when they work well, collect the resources of your organization. Those resources might be staff, they might be time, they might be money, they might be curricula, they could be vans, they could be buildings, they could be apartments, they could be meals. But you are going to collect those into a set of activities that you've designed very thoughtfully, very intentionally, and are very organized. When we plan programs, we always have to consider a lot of things. And among those are the capacity of your staff, the values of your organization, and the environment in which you are doing the work. Certainly over the last year, many of us have had to rethink the environment in which we are doing our work. And I think a lot of us have worked super hard at that to make sure that we did nothing to let our clients down. Programs should be worthy of your board keeping an eye on them. That oversight is important. Some boards have official program committees. Some request an organization to present program data at every board meeting. Some may be accountable to community advisory groups as well. But what's important is that somebody besides you and your CEO are keeping an eye on programs to make sure that they are truly meeting the needs of the community. Some programs are ongoing, and yet some within them may be time limited. So for instance, you may always be doing after-school program for children, or you may always be serving and feeding people in your shelter program. However, you might have specialized programs within that overall big program that are limited by time or dollars or other kinds of events. Programs always are based on the needs in our community, and those needs are always changing for sure. They're also based on organizational priorities. That means that they tend to be driven by data. That data may be what you collect, it may be what others collect, and increasingly, it is so important that that data include a lens on equity. Programs can be large, they can be small. They can be defined by a given population and its characteristics. They might be defined by zip code. They might be defined by topic. Your organization will know how to define those programs, but the point is, one size might not fit all. Programs need to be creative and engaging. Do you know there's a saying in human service work that programs are voted on by people's feet? And certainly, while that hasn't always been the case in a pandemic world, it certainly has been a case when we're doing programming in person. And certainly, even in the pandemic world, if our programs weren't engaging and creative, we didn't get to interact with people even on screens. Programs give you the foundation for fundraising and your budget. It is often the largest expense of an organization, and so your ability to define them correctly and to budget for them appropriately will really matter. Programs might be both internal. In other words, maybe you're trying to change the culture of your organization. Maybe in order to implement a new set of services for clients, you need to do a lot of staff training or board training. That's an example of an internal program. But most of us do programs that are external most of the time. And lastly, programs are not perfect, The world in which we try to operate those programs isn't perfect. And so our job is to simply do the very best that we can. And so let's think about data for a minute, because data should drive your programs. So I would encourage you in this moment to reflect a bit on some data sources that you might have used. I'm going to guess, but I can't be 100% certain, that maybe you've used census data. Maybe you've relied on the Savvy data from the Polis Center at IUPUI. Maybe you've relied on Kids Count data from the Indiana Youth Institute and the Annie Casey Foundation. Maybe you've shopped for data on federal, state, and local programs on any number of databases. Maybe you have access to data from affinity or professional groups that you belong to. Maybe you use data from expert studies and researchers. I certainly hope that you're using data from your very own organization. Your attendance records, your enrollment records, your usage records all give you important sources of information that can help you guide program decisions. So let's think about what makes an effective program once you've gathered up all that data. Effective programs are often best planned by a team. Each of us has gifts and strengths, and each of us can be supplemented in those gifts and strengths by others. And so to have people that don't think like you on a team when you're planning programs can usually make a better quality product. Really high quality programs are often created with client or potential client input. You might choose to do focus groups. You might choose listening sessions or surveys. You might choose to literally invite people to the table with you. But chances are that if you plan a program with your clients, your customers, the children, the adults at the table, your program is more likely to not only be appealing, but relevant and grounded in what really matters for people. Effective programs are very focused on outcomes. As program planners, what we really want to do is make a difference. We want to change the attitudes and the skills and the knowledge of those that we work with. And so thinking about those from the get-go with great intentionality will result in a stronger and more effective program. Good programs are also very collaborative. It is rare that each of us has exactly what we need to operate our programs. We rely on our community partners for the assets and the strengths that they have. And so in as much as you offer your assets and strengths to others, we hope you also tap into them in creative ways. Sometimes folks may have the exact population group that you would like to work with, but they lack transportation to get them to your program, and that's what you can do. I can think of a program collaboration that I've been a part of where I literally had the money to be able to feed people when we convened them, and my program partners didn't. So our ability to host a program and to provide food for the guests was huge, and it really helped to inspire stronger levels of participation. What we know about programs is that we can work as hard as we can, but it's important to think about how are we going to build the audience? How are we going to share this information in a way that's both thoughtful and intentional so that we reach the clients we want to reach, or that we reach the audiences that we know can benefit from this work. So if you have a marketing department, it is really great to get them in on decisions and conversations very early on. If you don't, and you're relying, for instance, on board members to help you with that, or partner organizations to help you with that, or if you've got to do it by yourself, make sure that you begin to think about that even as you begin to think about those earliest moments of planning, because well-planned programs don't do us much good if we don't manage to get people at the table with us. Okay, so let's dive in. This is an old slide, but you know what? It still works and it's super effective. So this is a program logic model. Many of you are likely familiar with this, but in the event that you aren't, let's just take a quick look. First off, I'm going to invite you to begin at the end. I'm going to invite you to begin with outcomes. And I'm going to invite you to do that because that's going to result in stronger program planning. It's not hard for us, those of us who love to do programs, to sort of come up with the big picture all at once in our head, and we've got it. But then it's important for us to step back and say, okay, it seems like a good idea, but let me test this. Let's think about outcomes. And so what we're going to do from the very beginning is say, gosh, if somebody is in my program, what do we want them to gain from it? What new knowledge? What new skills? What new attitudes or values that result in changed behavior? What will change a condition or a status for them or for the community? So starting with the end in mind matters. Often when I begin to think about programs, my first question is, what do I want to be different? And I have to think about that. And if I am thinking about it in a really good way with partners and collaborators and teammates, the likelihood is I'm going to come up with a pretty solid plan. The importance of doing that in a team means that you can kind of test it against each other to make sure that if what you're doing is a 6-month program, that your outcomes are actually realistic given that. And when you think about outcomes, as you look at that list that's on the screen, knowledge is relatively easy, right? I might learn to do a story problem in math, or I might learn how to change the oil in a car, or maybe I've learned how to knit a scarf. I don't know, could be anything, right? That new skill or knowledge are pretty, while they might be tricky to teach, they're relatively easy to acquire. But the more sophisticated our program and the more we layer on multiple programs, we're able to get to the improved condition or altered status. So, for instance, might have to do with homelessness, right? I might be able to teach somebody a set of skills that would enable them to be a new homeowner. That's great. But maybe lots of other things will have to take place before they actually own their own home. And so programs can often be additive. Okay, so once I've thought about my outcomes, now I'm going to bounce over to the inputs part of this, and we'll start working from the left. First off, inputs are the resources that you have. You have so many at your fingertips. Chances are you wish you had more, but we have lots at our fingertips and the fingertips of our partners. So that's going to include money. It will include your staff and volunteers, not only their skills, but their time. It'll include the facilities that you have. That could be a building, it could be a park, it could be a swimming pool. It's going to include the equipment and supplies that you have. So that's everything from construction paper to curriculum to food, anything. Each of us, it might be cameras, it could be sewing machines, could be any number of things. So think about what you're going to need to add together. What literally will you put into the mixing bowl to make that program? Each of us at that same time needs to give a little bit of thought to the constraints on our program. There might be laws that govern when we can actually do the work or limitations on hours. There might be regulations that we need to comply with for health or for safety. There might be requirements that the funder has. For instance, I'm thinking about a program that I'm working on right now, and I need to reach 500 families. So I need to think about that from the very beginning as I begin to think about my inputs. Once I have my inputs, then I need to begin to think about what people will do. What will I do? And what will my customers, my clients, the young people, the families, the adults do. We might feed people and we might shelter people. There might be job training. There might be tutoring. There might be public education about any number of public health issues. We might be counseling women or men or children, or we might be creating mentoring relationships for young people or perhaps for people leaving incarceration or any number of things. But you'll notice that as you look at that list, each of those things begins with a verb, and activities are always verbs. So thinking about what you will do with your ingredients will be the activities part of your program logic model. Each of those things will result in things that quite literally you can count. And so setting up your record keeping system from the very beginning is going to matter. You will count how many classes you teach. You might count how many sessions you offered. You might count how many materials you distributed. You might count how many times you offered the service and what the length of each of those times is. You will count how many people were served. You might count how long they stayed. So thinking about those kinds of things in the beginning will not only yield important program planning data later, but it will help you from the beginning set up your record keeping system. Now, if you begin to look at this graph, a bit like a math problem, you are going to add your inputs and your activities, and those are going to equal your outputs. But then with a little more love and a little more time and a little more care, they're going to result in the outcomes. I want to caution you to make sure that your outputs and your outcomes are two very different things. I can count, for instance, how many times a child went to a swimming lesson. But unless I skill test that child, unless I observe that child, I won't know if that child actually learned to swim. And that's the difference that I want to make. I would encourage you to do this kind of thinking for your own organization, to think about how to do this kind of a chart and an equation. You might think about putting together a chart that looks very much like this. And when we look at this chart, and you can easily create one, right? So listing your outputs on the far left, listing the activities that you'll use for those outputs in that second column, and then what am I going to count as a result in that third column matters. But here's where the best thinking will come in. You'll notice that I have columns for initial, intermediate, and long-term outcomes. Initial outcomes are exactly what they sound like. What's going to happen pretty much during the actual duration of this program? If it's a 6-week swim class, I can probably assume that children will learn to float, and they might learn how to drown proof, and maybe they'll be able to do a really basic stroke. And so I would say children will learn to swim this kind of a stroke, or children will learn to float on their back or their stomachs or whatever. So the intermediate outcome of that, something that maybe will happen 6 months to 2 years from that swim class, might have to do with children and families being more comfortable in the water. It might have to do with people more likely to visit public parks and to go swimming. It might have to do with a percentage of children enrolling in advanced swimming classes and being able to do additional skills. Does that make sense? And I know that you can think that through for your program too. And then the longer term one, if we stick with our swimming analogy for a minute, might literally have to do with fewer drownings and fewer accidental deaths for children. It might have to do with greater health benefits long term. It might be an opportunity for us to think about more young people competing in high school athletics. So as you begin to think about those very early steps of inputs and activities, realizing that the work that we do from the beginning can literally be life-changing matters. Now, it may be not in the scope of your program at all. If you're teaching beginning swimming, you might not have a good way to track that a child ended up on a high school swim team, right? But you could logically come to conclude that if a child had this experience early on, had additional experiences that helped them meet the intermediate outcomes, and then with additional programs was encouraged, they might logically meet those longer term outcomes. Think about that for a minute. That might be a really super conversation for you to have with your teammates and your colleagues and your partners. But this is the transformative work of programs. Our goal isn't to keep people busy and active. Our goal is to literally change lives. And we do that by always thinking about the benefits that we can bring to people. Okay, so just to review this for a quick minute. Inputs are those things that you dedicate to the program. You literally make investments in them, and sometimes the program uses them all up. When we think about things like crayons or construction paper or food or building materials or art supplies, those are going to be consumed by and large, right? And so we expect that even as we build budgets, we're going to need to budget for replenishing those. Staff and staff time, that's an important consideration early on because most of us don't have unlimited staff and most of us have staff with some limited hours. So thinking about the amount of time we want to dedicate to this program for a particular staff member is going to matter. If you are planning the program and you think, oh, it's going to take this staff member 25% of their time to do that, that's super, because then you can budget for that. But if you've got that same staff member involved in 5 different programs, each requiring 25% of their time, now you're in a different budget mode, right? Now you're thinking about overtime or programs that aren't going to be well implemented. So this thoughtful time early on matters. Thinking about your volunteers is equally important. There are some programs that are largely delivered by volunteers. You can think about youth organizations that do that, for instance. But again, that volunteer time is such that it needs to be a reasonable expectation for people. And you want to make sure that you are asking people for a specific set of skills. When we're doing volunteer recruitment, we never want to say, oh, come help, right? Volunteers are non-paid staff and we need to have job descriptions for them. So thinking about and putting boundaries around that volunteer time is also important. That also becomes a really important metric for you, because if you know through your program data that effective programs work, for instance, when a tutor spends a certain amount of hours per week with a young person or with an adult who's learning English, then you have to guarantee that that volunteer is going to be able to deliver that. And you know that if the volunteer and the client do less than that time, your work isn't going to be effective. So it's an example of not only a clear job description, but the need to keep good metrics. Each of us also has some access to facilities. It's rare that we don't need some sort of a facility. Although even that being said, we're all online right now, right? But still, that requires a facility, right? A place to sit and quite literally a place to be online. But we have buildings, we have campgrounds, we have parks, we have pools, we have studios, we have any number of other facilities that we might use. Those inputs, when it comes to facilities, becomes important because we might have to schedule around other people. We might be able to charge part of the cost of that facility to a particular grant that we might be applying for, or perhaps we need to think about scheduling in such a way that we have cleaning time in between. So Facilities has become a little trickier in this past year. Nonetheless, if we don't have facilities, we might have to think about partners that we can access them through, right? So giving the kind of time that you need to really think about your physical needs and transportation needs, I would include in that, will also matter. Equipment and supplies can be consumable. They might also be somewhat permanent. It has not been uncommon for many of us to buy Chromebooks or laptops or iPads, right? Knowing upfront if that is going to go home with a family or with a child and never be returned, that's an important consideration. Is it equipment that will only be used if someone is in your building? For instance, if you're teaching people how to cook or how to do home construction, you might have the tools that you need only in your facility. The supplies are likely to be consumable. And thinking about those that you might need to pay for versus those that you might be able to get donated or a partner might provide would be really a helpful consideration up front as you're building the budget for your program. And thinking about what your partners bring to the table. They bring skills for sure, and that's why we enjoy working with them so much. They also bring the gift of their time, and they bring their organizational and institutional assets with them. Those assets could be the clients themselves, it could be their expertise, it could be their curriculum, it could be their tools, could be any number of things. But you will want to sort of enumerate that from the beginning so that you know how to account for it and you know where your gaps are. It is helpful to have a very upfront conversation with your partners to say, I'm thinking about applying for this grant, or I'd like to do this program. Here's what I have to put on the table. And I know that you care about this topic too. Is there any way that you could imagine we could work together that would be bigger than the two of us separately? That kind of good creative thinking leads to shared staff training. It leads to much bigger community outcomes. And it's what truthfully makes funders pretty excited. Okay, so you've done all your output thinking or your input thinking, I'm sorry. Let's think about the activities that you'll do. Activities are things that you might lead or conduct. They are also things that your clients, the young people, the families, whoever, that's who's going to be engaging in this activities, in the activities that you plan. So you might be offering workshops, but your clients will participate in them. You might be offering a series of meetings or counseling sessions. Tutoring is not an uncommon activity that can be for adults or for young people. Coaching, again, for adults or for young people. Same for training and educating and mentoring. You might be cooking meals. You might be fostering animals. You might be fostering children. Thinking about the verbs that your organization offers will help you right then as you begin to make this list. Thinking about those things that your partners do will also help you in making this list. Remember that when you invent your activities, those are going to give you the basis for your outputs. And if you look at each of those words that I've written on the screen, I hope you can begin to imagine, what would I count? I would count attendance. I would count perhaps the age or demographics of the people participating. I might count how long they stayed. I might count how frequently they came. I might count whether or not their work was monitored for a certain amount of time each time. We might count the number of products produced. For instance, if you're teaching someone to cook, you might be able to count how many projects they can produce in an hour or in a 2-hour period. So thinking about all the ways you can parse that data in the beginning is going to help you with your evaluation and your record keeping. So, quick review. These are the direct products of your program activities. That evaluation and record keeping system, I know I've said it a lot, but it's going to matter to those who we want to be accountable to our funders, to our board, to our clients, to the community itself. We want to be able to say, my work mattered, and here's the level of the work. So again, thinking about all the numbers and how you're going to capture that. All right, now, here comes the big juicy part. We want to think about outcomes. We want to think about how we would describe the benefits for participants during the program activities and after they're completed. We want to be able to describe the changes that they experienced. And so, just to review, we talked about what new knowledge do they have? Do they know how to do math in a new way, or do they have new STEM skills? Or do they know now how to budget differently? Or do they know how to speak English? Or do they know how to earn a certain job certification? So knowledge comes at all levels, some very short lessons, some very long ones, but we can measure knowledge. Similarly, we can measure skills. Not only do they have it, but how well do they have those skills? We can think back to things we might have done either as an adult or a child. It's like, yeah, I learned to do that, but I sure wish I'd learned it better, right? And so you'll be able to not only measure the skill acquisition, but the degree of success. We'll also talk about whether or not people have changed their attitudes or values. Now, that's not likely to happen in a really fast program, right? But often we see evidence of that in people's changed behaviors. So if people, for instance, have new knowledge and they have new skills, that might lead them to feeling more confident and competent, and that may change their behavior. They may feel less timid. They may present in a stronger way. They may be more inclined to take a good, positive risk. That would be an example of modified behavior. Next, conditions may improve for the individual or for the community. So if we are able to give people new knowledge and skills, if they have new attitudes about themselves and about their confidence, about their capabilities, that might change their behavior. That could change their life condition. It may change their housing. It may change their academic outcomes. It might change their employment outcomes, could change their health conditions. All of those kinds of things are exactly what our programs can lead to. We don't always know that in 6 weeks. We don't always know that in 6 months. We might not know that for 2 years, but those are our good, juicy long-term goals. And finally, all of those things can result in an altered status for that individual, not only in the community, but perhaps in their long-term employment opportunities, perhaps in their long-term family or educational outcomes. If you're doing a program around the environment, for instance, and people's ability to tend to environmental things, planting trees, doing sustainable growth, all those kinds of things, that could mean a better outcome for the city or for the community. So thinking about how to add all those things together will end up helping each of us make sure that our programs are as effective as possible. I would challenge you that this is often the trickiest thinking that you'll do, but it's the most important. And so I hope you'll spend some real time thinking about it and really pushing back on your own thinking and the ideas that your teammates and partners bring to the table. It's good, rich, important conversation. Okay, so at some point you will need to document these outcomes. And I'm going to encourage you to not make your life terribly complicated, but to sort of use a formula. And this is one way to make sure that what you're really describing is what's happening for your clients or your participants and not what your staff is doing to keep busy. And so when I write outcomes, this is my formula. And it's a pretty good one to use, not only as you think about marketing materials you might develop, but funding proposals you might write as well. You're going to start with a noun, your client. So that could be parents, it could be preschoolers, it could be high school students, it could be young athletes, it could be any number of clients that any of you serve, right? And then use the word will after that. Not only is that future focused, and not only does that sort of describe a sense of momentum, but it literally begins to describe the promise you're going to make. And then think about the verb. What is the desired change that you want? Will they learn to go off a diving board? Will they execute a 3-course meal flawlessly? Will they learn to play piano? Will they be able to roof a house, right? So your programs, I can't even guess what they might be, although I can imagine the richness of them. Your ability to be pretty specific right here is going to make it easier for you to measure it and for your customers, your clients to have a good sense of satisfaction about it. It will also help your staff, your board, your funders feel really, really good about that. A good test right here is to say, okay, my client will do X, whatever that is, and then ask yourself, how would I know? And when you ask yourself the question, how would I know? That actually is the beginning of your outcome thinking and your evaluation thinking, because you could write a really good outcome or what you think is a really good outcome. But if you can't think of a way to document that or to prove it in a way that's not onerous and burdensome and super, super expensive and more trouble than what it's worth, then you probably don't have a really good outcome. You might need to modify that. And so again, give it a test. Outcome writing, good outcome writing takes a minute or two. So the client will do what? And then you're going to ask yourself, how would I know? Once you think you've nailed that part of the outcome down, then you might want to put a time limit on it. They'll do this by the end of the 6-week session. They'll do this by the end of the semester. They'll do this by the time they finish 8th grade. They'll do this during the certification program, whatever it might be. And to what extent? Will it be 75%? Will it be 100%? Will it be 50%? You want to make a guess, an estimate really, that's reasonable. This is not a time necessarily to overestimate, understanding that it's kind of rare that each of us nails this at the 100% level. So if you think that it's reasonable that 75% of your clients will finish a 12-week course, maybe that's okay. And maybe what you can do is to say, we're going to go for 75, but we're going to stretch a little and we're going to learn as much as we can so that the next time we do this program, we can increase it to 80 or to 85%. So remember that the outcomes that you write and evaluate now will help you to improve your program in the future. Got it? So think about the desired change you want, the attitudes, the skills, the knowledge, the changed behavior, the improved conditions, the time period in which you think you can accomplish that, and then lastly, to what extent you might be able to do that. It's a lot of thinking, worthwhile in the very beginning. And so your evaluation thinking should automatically kick in right at the moment of writing those writing your outcome objectives. So let's just review. An outcome will predict the change a client experiences. Maybe the outcome you want is that 75% of the students who enroll in your program will be accepted to at least 2 colleges. So you've got, they're going to finish the program, and you've got an extent, they're going to be accepted to 2 colleges, and you have a change status. They will be accepted, right? So you've got 3 things implied in that. There are things along the way that you might want to track. What are the pieces of data we'll have to gather to make sure that we're on track to do that? So if we think for a minute about some sort of a college preparation program, those indicators, those specific data points might be your ability to literally check off, did this child complete the FAFSA with his or her family? Did they complete at least 2 college applications? Were there any specialized admissions tests that were required? That's a check mark too. You might want to be monitoring students' grades, right? So we never want to leave an outcome measure kind of hanging out there till the end. We should be building our evaluation thinking along the way so that we are doing everything we could to increase the likelihood of success. And then we may have an evaluation target. That's our rate of success. Maybe we want to make sure that not only does that child receive at least 2 admissions letters, but maybe they've also acquired scholarships as well. Overall, you could have a target for your overall program, but you could have targets for each individual student or client that you've enrolled. It is not a surprise, right, that many of us have heard, set your goal so that you can aim high. That's a part of what we're trying to do right now. But what we're also trying to do is to backfill it with all the recipes, all the inputs that we can imagine to make sure that that student acquires success. So think about this with your own program. Not sure what it is, excuse me. Not sure what it is, but it's the kind of thinking that not only can you do, but you'll excel at. Okay, so we're going to go back just for a quick minute and do a short moment of review. Remember that our outcomes come in 3 levels, and don't be afraid to think big and brave and bold on this. We want those initial changes and benefits. Those are going to be the closest tied to the outputs, right? Those activities. Those are going to be our attitudes, our skills, and our knowledge. If we want someone to learn to do something, how many classes did they have to attend? How many counseling or mentoring sessions, whatever it might be, that's going to affect attitude, skills, and knowledge. And then we're going to begin to think about those slightly longer term benefits, which might lead to behavior change. You know what those will be for your program. And I encourage you to, again, be brave and bold when you do that. And then ultimately, what will be the life changes or the status changes for your clients or for the community or for the students in your school, whatever it might be. Remember, all along that path, you're going to ask if-then questions. If this happens, and if that happens, and if this other thing happens, then is it reasonable to conclude that these outcomes will occur for your clients and for your participants? If the answers are yes, then you are on a really super path. Remember, take a moment now, write an outcome for your program. What do you want to see happen in the short run? Just jot a couple notes. And then do the same thing for a year or 2 from now. Hopefully you've been doing that all along. Again, let's think about why we're going to do these tests for these outcomes. We're using the word outcomes a lot because it's the most important part. Everything else kind of hangs on that. Is it reasonable to think that you can influence, that's the key word, influence the outcome, even if you can't 100% control it, right? Each of us have had experiences in our own lives where we thought we were so prepared, we were so ready, we just had this so solid, and then it didn't work the way we thought it would because the weather was bad or because I didn't feel well that day or who knows what it was. So We can't always guarantee or control, but we can do everything we can to influence the outcome. Also think about whether or not measuring that outcome would help you to identify whether or not your program was being successful or where you had to bolster it. Maybe let's say you were teaching a new skill or a new language to someone, and maybe you went in with the assumption that if somebody practiced this new skill, I don't know, 30 minutes a week, 3 times a week, they would master something in a certain amount of time. And then you realize, oh, actually, we need an hour a week, and it should probably be 5 days a week. That's going to help you identify a way to not only make your program more successful, but to shore up where your shortcomings are. Program evaluation is the same as program improvement. Once you know what you need to do, then you can make it better. Another test for an outcome is whether or not the publics you serve will see this as valid. Will your clients see this as reasonable? Will your board see this as reasonable? Will your partners see this as reasonable? How will your donors react to that? How will your funders react to that? What about the public in general? Would that be seen as a valid outcome for you? If we invested all this time and all this money and all these resources, does it make sense that this change would actually occur? And so think about, even as you're thinking about this last question, whether or not the publics will see it as valid, begin in this moment to think about how you'll tell the stories of success and how you'll tell the stories of lessons learned. That's part of how you're going to end up marketing your program, right? It's part of how you're going to build program sustainability and additional resources for your program. So taking the time during the path that your program is occurring on to document stories as well as the data is going to help you to do that in an effective and meaningful way. Next, I'd like you to think about a few more things. Do these outcomes have a logical relationship? Does it make sense if I add A and B that C is likely to be a good flow? Or do I need one more thing in there somewhere? Only you will know that for your own program, but it is reasonable, for instance, if I'm thinking about teaching someone how to swim, that they would need to pass some different skill tests, that they would need time in the pool, that they would perhaps need to learn how to breathe differently, all kinds of things. And if I add all those together, would they earn some sort of a swimming certificate? Well, likely so. But if I took out pool practice time, that's not going to happen, right? So thinking about the logic and making sure that you've thought through that picture in a good full way is going to be helpful. And making sure that you capture the whole of your program. So if you've got a whole series of inputs and a whole series of outputs, are you somehow capturing all those in your outcomes? Only you will know that because only you have that list on paper or in your head right now. And thinking hard from the beginning about the meaningful changes long-term for people, quality of life, status, improved health, improved financial stability, improved housing stability, less food insecurity, whatever those might be. Thinking about those from the beginning not only demonstrates that you have vision for your program, but that you are taking deliberate steps to help those that you serve accomplish those really good outcomes. And lastly, it's a rare one of us who hasn't discovered negative outcomes to your programs. Here's an example. I can think about a program that I knew about once that required parents and children to be at a certain number of sessions together. And on the surface, that seemed like a really good idea, that this organization was going to coach them through good quality time, and that They were going to learn all these new skills together, and it would enhance family relationships, all these things that just made really great sense. Until about halfway through the first session of this, when the negative outcome of those good intentions was that it meant families didn't have as much time at home together to do homework or to simply relax and play together, that they actually felt super scheduled. And so that was an unintended negative consequence and outcome. So that meant, because that was identified, that people could adjust, that they could work with the clients, that they could work with the families and say, how might we solve this together? Right? That is program growth. That is not program failure or program shortcoming, but it's recognizing unintended negative outcomes and working to make them better. And so let's remember, evaluation is the intentional way of monitoring your progress and making improvements in your program. And you need indicators, you need little data points for your outputs, for your outcomes. You also need to think about the level of achievement that you hope each of those things will accomplish. You're going to get that data from your own records and from others, from your partner's data, from community data, from the exact records you're keeping as a part of your program. You may hire people or ask for volunteers, people who have specific areas of expertise. You might ask someone to come in and observe your program and use rubrics and scorecards to do things. You might train people to do that. You might end up having a set of tests or measurements or surveys that you administer. Some of those may be pre and post, some may be only post. Some may be very heavily validated. Some may be sort of in the moment, say 3 things that you learned as a result of, being in this session, whatever it might be. But think about how you might gather very specific data. There are certainly lots of books. The public library has tons of books on program measurement and evaluation. And one of the great ways, if you don't feel like you have a lot of evaluation strength, one of the great ways to get better is simply to talk to colleagues. It may be that your colleagues have tried things that you didn't even imagine thinking about, or it may be that they have tools or devices or even techniques that they can share with you. Think too about data sources that might be available in the general public. Certainly there are so many online tools that you might be able to use if that's of interest to you. So don't be afraid to be brave and to try something new. It is important, however, that if you're serious about looking for funding for a program, that you have thought through how you're going to evaluate it. You'll want to make sure that when you think about data collection, that it is something that you can do. It's really great to think, oh gosh, I'd like to survey every parent of a young child in Indiana. Well, that's great, but that may not be very realistic, right? So you might need to think about a random sample, or you might need to think about targeted counties, or you might need to think about clients and specific agencies. You need to think about how much time and money and sophistication you have to deploy to data collection. You want to make sure that if you are collecting data, you're doing it so that you have information that's actually useful for the people who are running the program, and that they can actually use that to improve the program. And so if you know over time that you need to make sessions longer or shorter, then make that adjustment. And if you're doing evaluation in a good way, that's going to do it. And lastly, will this have credibility for people outside the program? Will others look at this and say, oh yeah, they got this. They know what they're doing. Make sure that you've assigned people clear tasks. Some will gather the data, some will report the data. Be consistent from the beginning. Make sure that you capture not only the numbers, but the stories that surround them, the pictures, the images. Take time to analyze and reflect on those, communicate your findings. And if there is a report due, do your level best to make sure that you get it in on time. That is the end of the presentation. If you have questions, I encourage you to visit your local library. You will find a rich collection of books on program planning and program evaluation in the social sciences department. I encourage you to talk to friends and colleagues and coworkers, and I encourage you to take risks on behalf of those you serve. Thanks so very much.